As I said, we're going to see this one clip from My Beautiful Launderette, and then have a short discussion on that, and that will bring an end to that segment. And then I'm going to wind up with a kind of a brief discussion about Indians in Britain, which has been the subject from last week. So we'll be finishing up with that sometime today, and we'll probably have time to move into the next segment of the course, which is in a way sort of the bulk of the course. It's that middle portion of the course where we look at the history of Indians in the United States, and today what you're going to have is a overview of that, which will continue into Thursday, and then in the subsequent weeks we're going to look more closely at some aspects of the history of the Indian diaspora in the U.S., focusing on such things as religion and so on. So, by the end of this week, we'll be entirely caught up. We're pretty much on schedule because the way the course has been, the syllabus has been designed, this week, as I said, is kind of an overview of that history of Indians in the diaspora, and so by Thursday we'll certainly be done with that segment of it. All right. So let me get to the clip here, which is, I don't know if anybody here had eventually a chance to see the film, because this video furnace now has been working at least intermittently. I had some problems a few days ago, but for the most part it has been working since last Thursday now. Let's see if we can just move this. Okay, why is this? All right. Just give me a minute to get the clip to the right place. It's kind of freezing now. Okay, now we've got a bit of a problem again here. We're going to have to reset this. Does anybody have any questions in the meantime that they want to ask while I try to get this to work for us?
We can discuss the difference in the religions between the Sikhs and Hindus during the religious portion of the course.
It depends on what exactly is the kind of discussion you have in mind, because are you asking for a general distinction between the two? Well, I can mention that. I mean, certainly during the course of my lecture, but I think that will come in the section which has to do with religion rather than now. I don't know if somebody here can just try to manipulate this while I get to my lecture, because this is going to really delay us now again if it's. Yeah, I don't know. Not very successful here. Okay, let's just try again. Yeah, it's not moving, but let me try again. Let me see if. Yeah. Okay, I need to get to 121. So 81 minutes. Let's see if we can get it to. Okay, we need to move up the volume a bit too. Okay, see, it's not moving now here. See, if we need to move this to one. In fact, actually, just a little before that would be good, if you could get it to that point. It should be moving. I don't know why it's not moving. So, all right. So, sorry.
Try using Internet Explorer.
Try using it where?
Internet Explorer.
No. Is that better than
it might
Google
work.
Chrome? Okay. Why don't we see if we can do it that way? Yeah, it'll be useful to have this pinned down because there were other occasions when it needs to be used too. So it's a bit of a problem if it's not. It seems to be a bit better now. Yeah, if you could stop right there, move back just a bit to 21. That's good. If we can get it here. Okay, and we're not getting any volume now, right? Okay. Okay. So, does anybody have any thoughts on this clip that we saw? It seems to me that it encapsulates many of the questions that we want to talk about, which is why I wanted you to take a look at it. Would anybody like to begin with, what you think you saw here? What's happening here? What are some of the kinds of considerations that come up? Anything that comes to mind. And it could be a continuation of the discussion we were having last Thursday, fresh considerations. Yeah.
I think it goes back to the role reversal and how, Salim was the one who thought that those Britishers were the scum instead of the other way around.
Okay. Yeah. You want? He couldn't. Maybe you could just repeat what you said. Yeah.
It's kind of goes back to the role reversal about how Salim thought that the Britishers were the scum instead of the other way around when he was the one attacking them instead of the diaspora being victimized.
Right. So role reversal, right? Anything else that comes to mind? Yeah.
I guess there's this breakdown between when Nasser and Hussein are conversing. I think his comment was telling about Hussein's comment about this country hates us and
Yeah.
we'll never be a part of it. And when these guys are beating up, Salim at the same time.
Right. Okay, so the conversation between the two brothers, and sort of the familiar debate, you might say, about the assimilation of the immigrant into the community that he or she has moved into, the longing for return, right, which will disappear by certainly the third generation, maybe even by the second generation. Right? Even perhaps by the second generation, that's already something that has greatly diminished, but certainly by the third generation, you're not going to find that to be the case. I mean, it would be very difficult, for example, to find an Italian-American, somebody of Italian-American descent today, whose forefathers came to Ellis Island circa 1900, and something goes wrong, and they'll say, well, let's go back to Sicily or whatever. I mean, you remember The Godfather, but that was only in the second generation that Michael Corleone, decides, well, let me head back. But of course, those are different circumstances. But you see what I mean? That it will be, there is a generational difference here too. And so this myth of return is important for certainly the first generation. There's always a possibility. And some people have argued that this is in a way, a kind of a weakness. That it's only at moments of weakness that you express this, or people who have very strong political sentiments and feel that somehow the country they've moved to cannot accommodate their political vision or their worldview. Right? You had your hand up, right? Yeah.
I was just going to say what you already said, that when times go wrong, that kind of feeling of blaming the country they come to.
Yeah. Okay. How about gender, by the way? How does that play into what is the role of women here? I mean, have you noticed that, what does Tanya do? She leaves. What does Rachel do? She leaves. Right? So what does this mean? I mean, just put it into any kind of framework that you can think of. What would a conservative person immediately think of? Yeah. Sorry?
They're losing control and how the women...
Okay, so what's the word for that? What is the system where men exercise patriarchy? Right? So is there an argument here that immigrant families, I'm not giving you my assessment, I'm just posing it as a question, all right? Because patriarchy can be found in non-immigrant families too. I mean, that's not a condition specific to immigrant families, although there is an argument to the effect that in immigrant families it tends to be stronger because immigrants are generally coming from, cultures. So, for example, 1900, 1920, the example I gave a few minutes ago, Italy. Even today, the argument would be highly patriarchal culture. South Asia, all of South Asia, highly patriarchal. Right? And so that one of the things that the men are worried about is the diminishment of their control over the family, and particularly its female members. Right? Now the question is that is this particular to the diasporic condition? If it's to be found in the general population, I'll take your question in a second. Right? Or is it the case that it's aggravated in the diasporic condition? Right? Because the other side of it is that women have a greater measure of control over their own sexuality and their own life choices. That would be the general argument. Is the filmmaker more or less falling into this line of argument? And is this what the departure of Tanya is supposed to signify? Right? So it signifies a number of things. An argument about what happens to patriarchy in these conditions. Okay? And here we are speaking about, frankly, a family that's not in some ways particularly conservative. I mean, some elements of it are conservative, but certainly it's not the kind of conservatism that stops you from having a white woman as a mistress. Right? I mean, look at it this way, because if it was truly conservative in the sense in which we might think of conservative, then we'll say, well, that includes conservative sexual mores, but are conservative sexual mores only for women? They're not for men. Right? An argument that obviously that feminists have worked out in very substantial detail, and there's been discussion about that for a very long period of time, because obviously there seem to be greater kinds of restrictions on the mobility of women and their sexual choices than would be the case for men. So there's this set of considerations, right? Then there's this, let's put it in a slightly different framework, the dissolution of the family. Right? And again, that need not be specific to diasporic conditions. I mean, the US, the breakdown of the traditional family, and I think we should underscore the word traditional, because some people would argue it's not that the family is disappearing, it's just that it's being reconstituted. Right? I mean, there's no reason why two men raising a child cannot be thought of as a family according to that line of argumentation. So let's just accept that provisionally and say that, well, it could be the dissolution of the old style traditional family and perhaps the reconstitution, of the family. But what is certainly clear is that there seems to be some hint of that over here as well in the scene that you see, right?
I was thinking, I feel like there's a lot of intersection, like the intersectionality of the race and the gender has a lot to do with it. Because in looking at like Nasser, if you compare his relation with Rachel as opposed to his relation with his own wife or with Tanya.
Yeah.
Albeit she's his daughter, so that's like a different relation. But with his wife, I feel as though his relation with Rachel, it seems that they're more equal in their like power in that relationship than with his wife, where she's completely dominated by him.
Yes, right.
But I feel like in the diaspora, like Rachel being white has a lot to do with her. Like, I mean, she ends the relationship too in the end, so I feel like
yes,
that has a certain level of power that his wife doesn't have the power to achieve.
Yeah, but I think that we may want to bring in some modification there. I mean, it's easier for her to walk out because she's not part of the family, in any case. So it's not simply the fact that she's white and therefore more liberal and more liberating. That's one possible interpretation. I agree with you. But The fact is that she's not married to him. So therefore, she doesn't have that liability. You would always have to think twice or 20 times or 200 times before you walk out of a marriage. Even if it's an oppressive marriage. But I think that the first part of the remark that you made, that I would agree with the general thrust of that there seems to be the suggestion that Nasser himself exemplifies, you might say, a double personality. That with his wife he has a certain kind of relationship which seems to conform to the traditional relationship, okay, where he's domineering, patriarchal, so forth and so on. Although it's his wife who orchestrates, right, the infliction of wounds on the mistress, right? Because she comes, during that conversation you hear where Rachel says to Nasser, well, your wife's a brilliant woman. I mean, look what she did, right? Okay, so that immediately raises questions about what we understand about this alleged powerlessness of women in these traditional patriarchal relationships. That they may have other modes of exercising power which may not be that transparent necessarily, right? But certainly there is a kind of split in a way where the relationship with Rachel seems to be a relationship more in the mold of a kind of a liberal, right, relationship where she has some degree of power, he has some degree of power. Nasser's relationship with his wife seems to be more of a traditional sort. In general, right? So you can see that it encapsulates a whole series of questions. And then, of course, there's a question of the punks, the working class culture they come from. Is the resentment of Johnny's ex-friends, is it simply the resentment of those who think that Johnny has now moved over across the divide to the other side? But is that moving over simply a moving over from your own white culture to another culture, or is it also a move across class? I mean, it's very clear. If you look at the way that Salim dresses, I mean, he's very dapper. He's always in suits and ties, grooms himself. Nasser, always well dressed, right? So these people, and for those of you who've seen the film, I mean, you've seen shots of their home and everything. I mean, these people are moving in a different class background. So the problem that the punks are having with Johnny, we should not assume, by the way, that this is simply a problem that they're having with him because what he's done is he's gone native, so to speak, right? He's gone desi in this context, right? That he's now sided with the South Asians, betrayed his own dominant white culture. There's also a class divide here, which is a very considerable divide, And then, in fact, Johnny raises interesting questions that, look, I mean, the fact of the matter is that Omar has actually employed me. It's a good job. When Tanya says to him, well, why don't you leave with me? He says, well, there aren't that many jobs around. This is a good job, right? So obviously, the idea that some people are more motivated by the desire for self-enhancement, okay, for self-improvement, a certain degree of self-respect. So you could now raise an entirely different question. Is what distinguishes Johnny from his former friends, right? Is what distinguishes the fact that he has a certain kind of self-respect which perhaps they have lost, and they may have lost it because now these people are finding themselves to be on the margins of a society at which they were the center at one point. Those who were at the center. So here's an analytical framework you can think about, another analytical framework. That these people who are exceedingly English and think of themselves as exceedingly English and therefore are at the center, obviously, of their own society, have now been moved in almost every respect to the periphery. They've been moved to the periphery. They're on the margins now. Look at their work culture, look at their employment prospects, look at the fact that a new immigrant class has come in and has now started employing their likes. Okay? Right? Their very notion of what it means to be British and what it means to be English and what they think of as the heart of English culture is beginning to get very slippery. Right? And that's the brilliance of the film, that it's able to work at these multiple levels, looking at the politics of race, class, gender, ethnicity, the whole question of immigration, diaspora, what are the centripetal and centrifugal trends? What are things that push you towards the middle, and what are the things that push you away from it? Right? And that's the sort of thing that I think you ought to be looking at, which is one reason, again, we're looking at this in some detail, not only because it helps us look at South Asians in Britain, but since all of you will be writing a paper on one of the other FEMs, these are the kinds of questions that you need to be raising. Now, I don't believe that all the other FEMs are necessarily of that complexity, but there are certainly questions of race, class, gender, all of this to be found in virtually all of the FEMs, with some degrees of variation, obviously, but in the FEMs, the other FEMs that have been given to you. All right. Does anybody want to add anything further to this particular discussion of the FEM? All right, so what I want to do now is I just want to go back to my general discussion of the history of Indians in the Britain, and I want to sort of remind you of some of the main trajectories that we are talking about. So you have to take your mind back now to the 1940s, post-World War II, a period that I've talked about at some length, and the fact that immigration to Britain at that point in the late 1940s, early 1950s becomes important because Britain is a country that now has a economy that's been devastated by the war. There's obviously going to be efforts to put this economy back into shape. You have need for both skilled and unskilled labor in Britain, right? And you remember that one of the places that I'd started talking about, I'll go back to it in just a few minutes, is Southall, which is a part of Ealing. You start to get Punjabis coming into Ealing, into Southall, which is in the vicinity of the airport in the 1950s. All right, but this does not describe all the trends that we have going back to the 1950s all the way till the mid 1970s. I had suggested to you that there is also an explosion in the public services. The example that we looked at was the National Health Service, but you can also look at the transportation industry, right? So one of the photographs that you see quite frequently, early photographs of South Asians in Britain are photographs of Sikh drivers driving these famous red double-decker buses that you find in London. Right? And they're going to be employed in very substantial number in the Greater London Transport Council and the London Transportation Services. And there are going to be interesting questions that come up. We're not going to really look at them because we're going to look at them with respect to Sikhs in the US, but some of the questions that are going to come up are going to be questions, for example, about can Sikh drivers sport a beard? Right? Because, especially a long flowing beard. Can they wear a turban or not? Right? And these questions are going to be actually quite critical, particularly from the point of view of those who are interested in notions of cultural diversity, cultural pluralism, human rights, and so on. Because is this simply a matter of how you're dressed and what are the dress protocols that a company wants to observe for its employees, or are there more serious matters involved here? Right. So in the case of the Sikhs, the argument that a turban and a beard are intrinsic to their religion. Whether that claim is right or not is something that we would have to look at later on. But the argument being that this is intrinsic to their religion, and you can no more forbid that than you can forbid a Christian from working at a job, when they're wearing a cross, a necklace with a little cross, a chain around their neck. If that cannot be prohibited, why should a turban or a beard be prohibited for a Sikh male driver? Right? Questions of this kind will begin to crop up already in the 1950s. Right? Now, when we look at Britain, we're saying that, okay, in the 1950s, moving into the early 1960s, so we're saying that there are essentially the following trends. So what you have is people who are going to move in northern England, they're going to move into the textile mills. Right? In the area around Lancashire. And just a little historical footnote, so this we're talking about the northern part of Britain, but still England, not Scotland, okay? That the historical footnote being that it is these textile mills that had suffered immensely as a consequence of the campaigns waged by Gandhi in the 1920s and 1930s calling for the boycott of British goods and calling for self-reliance among Indians, right? Okay, so it's these industries that have now actually suffered quite considerably, and they're in need for labor power. So you're going to have a number of Indians who are going to move, as I said, into the northern part of England, into Lancashire and into Yorkshire. Then you have a second group of Indians. I'm still talking largely about people who are working in industry, so largely unskilled laborers here, okay, who are going to move into metal and hosiery industries in the Midlands, in what is called the West and East Midlands. Okay, and there are going to be places like Coventry, where you're going to find a substantial number of Indians. If you look at that reading that was assigned to you for week 3, the piece by Tinde, which is online, it actually has a map of Britain and it gives you the breakdown of some of these immigrants, right? And then you have people who are going to be moving into lighter manufacturing and transportation and more white collar, jobs, and the bulk of these are going to be in the area that is called Greater London. All right. So these are the 3 strands of migration that you find. If you want to split it up ethnically, or you want to split it up linguistically, what we're saying is that there are largely 2 linguistic groups that are going to be represented. One is going to be the Punjabis, largely Sikhs, by the way, okay, but some Hindus as well, some Muslims, but largely Sikhs, and then the next big group would be Hindus, because the Muslims are going to be coming from other parts of South Asia. They're not going to be coming, obviously, from the Punjab. In fact, in Indian Punjab doesn't really have any Muslims at all after the partition of 1947, right? And they're coming from the central districts of the Punjab. Then you've got Muslims coming from West Punjab, okay, and you've got some Kashmiri Muslims, right? Okay. All of these people coming into Britain in the 1950s and 1960s. Some Bangladeshis. Bangladesh does not exist, so the use of the word is a bit anachronistic. It's still East Pakistan at this point in time. It only becomes Bangladesh in 1971. But Bangladeshis or East Pakistanis coming from the northeastern part, a region called Sylhet. And then you've got Tamils, largely Hindus, coming from Sri Lanka. So you've got Sri Lankan Tamils. So it's a fairly mixed South Asian population that is coming into Britain at this point in time. Many of these jobs are fairly demanding, because this is really, as I said, blue-collar work for the most part. And Tinde actually speaks about what he calls the 3D jobs. D meaning dirty, dangerous, and demanding, right? That these jobs were, in fact, actually quite strenuous in many respects. Now, why is it that the bulk of these immigrants are coming from small areas? Partly, you go back to the history of indentured labor, you find the same phenomenon. And what is that phenomenon? Chain migration, to some degree. That once people start coming from a certain area, then a pattern of chain migration develops. And it partly develops because of information networks. Some money is being sent back to these areas, right? At this point in time, we're talking about very small sums of money, right? But we're still talking about some amount of money being sent back by these immigrants, and obviously stories about how they're doing in Britain. And so these information networks are quite critical in the development of this chain migration. And through the 50s, the labor force here is essentially a male labor force. You're going to get increased female participation in the labor market only really beginning in, I would say, about the mid-1960s. Right? When family reunification is also going to become an important element of immigration. Now, let's just consider very briefly the other side of the story. That if we have migration beginning from the late 1940s, early 1950s, moving into the early 1960s, that's over a decade. By this point in time, there are already demands being made by some people in Britain belonging largely to the Tory party, the Conservative Party, but you also have such parties as the British National Party, right? And some of these punks that you see in My Beautiful Launderette, if you look at the T-shirts that they wear, there's always a Union Jack. Okay, one of these guys, his T-shirts always has a Union Jack, the flag, right? And a suggestion that this is somebody who is not only a loyalist, but is certainly a member of either the National Front or the British National Party, which are parties that were already beginning to call for restrictions on immigration into Britain. And in 1962, you have the first Immigration Act, which is going to put some limits. It's going to put some limits, and the next big piece of legislation is going to be 1968. And what the 1968 Immigration Act in Britain does is very simple. It says that you do not have an automatic right of entry into Britain, even if you are a British passport holder. So they make a distinction between those British passport holders whose parents or grandparents were born in Britain, and those British passport holders who do not have either parents or grandparents who were born in Britain. So if you're a British passport holder and your parents were born or your grandparents were born in Britain, you have an automatic right of entry. But if you're a British passport holder and this does not apply, that neither your parents nor your grandparents were born in Britain, you do not have an automatic right of entry. Okay? So in other words, let's supposing you were a British passport holder and you had lived your entire life, which was, by the way, true of many Indians living in Kenya and Uganda, right? You had lived your entire life in those countries and you still held a British passport because you were a British subject. Well, when Idi Amin decided in 1972 to expel the Indians because he wanted to nationalize the economy, he wanted to essentially have black Africans take over the economy because he thought of the Indians as interlopers, and so these people are going to be expelled. Remember the figures I gave you, right? From 70,000 down to 1,000 in a very, very short period of time. Well, where are these people going to go? And the problem that I alluded to, I think you can understand that better now, and that was a problem of stateless people. Right? So these are people who are British passport holders, but remember the 1968 Act is now made a distinction between different kinds of British passport holders, and the 1971 Immigration Act is going to codify that much more strongly. It's going to make it much more explicit. In 68, they're still sort of wavering. They're not entirely certain how they're going to pursue this policy, but the 1971 Immigration Act is going to really put it in stone, as it were. 1972, a year later, you have got the expulsion. So where are these Indians going to go? Okay, because they don't carry Indian passports, you know, and they don't carry obviously Pakistani passports, right? So where are they going to go? And this is the condition of people that you very often describe as stateless, which is, you know, some Palestinians are stateless, if I may put it this way. That's another way to think about what the category of stateless essentially means. And there are actually, by the way, stories of some of these Indians from East Africa who essentially spent several years at an airport lounge, right? I mean, because they really have no place to go to. All right? They're being sort of more or less being moved back and forth. Sometimes they're put on a flight. When they arrive in Britain, they're told, well, we're not going to accept you. And they're sent back and they're said, well, we're not going to accept you. Some of them were given the option to go to India, and some of them chose that with the proviso that once these restrictions were eased, then they would eventually head to Britain, because what we're really saying is that most of these people didn't really feel any kind of attachment to India as such, as a physical place to which they would go, right? They may still have an attachment which may be an emotional and cultural attachment. We're not saying that they didn't partake of Indian culture in many respects, so forth and so on, right? But it was not a place to which you would go in order to make your living. All right, so now we have moved up till the 1970s, and we have said that, well, what we have is we also have an influx of people coming from East Africa. And generally what happened was that people tended to gravitate to those areas where there were already people from that community. Right? So in fact, in Britain, what they did, the British government had a policy. They basically made a distinction between what they called the red zone and the green zone. Okay? So the red zone was a zone to which you were not going to send immigrants, and these were zones where immigrants were considered to be living there in very large numbers. So they didn't want those areas to be completely swamped, as they put it, by immigrants. So in other words, if you already have, so let's say this is, I can't draw a map of Britain because India is much easier. The island of Britain is, Great Britain is much harder. But let's supposing, so here is London here, okay? And just for your information, so we're talking about Lancashire and over here. Right? And then you've got the Midlands. So there's this place here which is called Leicester. Okay? And what you're going to find in Leicester is a huge number of Gujaratis who began to move there. So here is a suburb of London, and this is Southall. And here you have Punjabis. So what was a green zone, red zone policy? The idea was that immigrants coming in from South Asia in the 60s, this red zone, green zone policy is basically a 60s policy. It doesn't really work, okay? But they try to implement it. That more immigrants who are coming in the 60s will be pushed away from these areas because they already have a substantial number of immigrants. If you get in more immigrants, these areas will become so heavily dominated by the immigrants that white Britishers will no longer feel comfortable here. So there's going to be a flight of these people. Right? So in order to prevent that from happening, they essentially wanted to channel these immigrants into areas where there were very few immigrants to begin with. But on the other hand, the natural movement, if I may put it this way, of immigrants is to always gravitate to people where you already have networks. Where you already have networks, because that's what makes you, that's what eases your way into that society. Brings you into a zone of familiarity, a so-called comfort zone, as they say. All right? And so what they found was that the Punjabis were all gravitating towards Southall because you already had a very substantial Punjabi population here. That the Gujaratis were all gravitating towards this area over here. Leicester, Loughborough, so forth and so on, because you already had a substantial number of Gujaratis. Right? So, and as I said, gradually they're going to abandon this policy when they find that it's not really working as such. All right? And then in the meantime, some of these other developments have taken place that I've spoken to you about in my previous lecture, such as, for example, what happens to an institution such as the corner shop, right? A quintessential British institution, and it's going to be largely taken over by the South Asians, right? And so when I say South Asians here again, we're speaking not only about Indians, but Pakistanis and Bangladeshis as well. There are, by the way, so the story that we're telling is a story not only of people going into, unskilled jobs and people going into the National Health Service, but they're obviously they're obviously people who are going to set themselves up as entrepreneurs. I mean, one of the most successful stories, and it's mentioned in the 10-day reading, and for those of you who ever go to an Indian grocery store, the minute I mention the name, you would recognize it, especially if you buy pickle, it's the Patel family, right? The Patel pickles that you find, these are actually coming from Britain. And it's a man called Patel who's going to set himself up in the food business, and there are going to be a large number of Indians who are going to move into the food industry, both wholesale and retail. And what you're going to begin to get then very slowly, beginning in the 50s, is a proliferation of South Asian restaurants. Now you go to a place like Manchester, I was there about 10 years ago, there's a whole strip, it's called Curry Mile. Excuse me, Curry Mile. Right? And it's called Curry Mile because for an entire mile what you have is essentially, one Indian restaurant after another. Okay? Right? And in Britain the number of Indian restaurants is so astronomical that in places like London and for Britain as a whole they have numerous competitions like the best chicken tikka masala, best chicken curry, so forth and so on. I mean, it's estimated that London has well over 1,500 South Asian restaurants. Right? So this is the transformation of this landscape that you're talking about. Now, we haven't spoken about some other elements of the story, but I've given you some hints of that, such as, for example, Indians in the other professions, for example, education. But one significant part of that story is that you've obviously got Indians, students who are no longer going to go into Britain, but are rather going to gravitate towards the United States. Partly it has to do with restrictive policies, partly it has to do with policies that were implemented under Margaret Thatcher, and there were already hints of that which introduce fee structures which make it much more expensive for Indian students Asian students more generally, coming from Commonwealth countries to study in Britain. And obviously, the US economy is at this juncture doing much better than the British economy, so you've got greater financial aid packages for students coming from Asian countries, particularly those who are coming for graduate work, right? For doctorates and other graduate degrees, other professional degrees. There are going to be South Asians who are going to enter into politics. That's a very interesting story, because I think that there you see a greater contrast than you do with South Asians in the United States, where Indian involvement, right, in politics was very, very limited. Very, very limited. I mean, in the last decade or so, we have seen some significant changes. There are 2 governors today out of 50 who are of Indian origin, Indian American, right? Both of them extremely conservative. Okay, we're going to get to them later on when we look at the South Asians in politics in the United States. In Britain, what you had was people who were elected either to the House of Commons, right, or were nominated to a peerage, and then eventually became, part of the House of Lords. There are, more than half a dozen South Asians who now sit in the House of Lords. But as you know, the House of Lords is not the equivalent to the Senate. Many people sometimes think that it's the equivalent to the Senate, because the House of Lords is really more a functional body. I mean, in Britain, the House of Commons is really the supreme legislative body, right? And the US, it's very different, because the Senate, of course, is extremely powerful, as is the House, but in this respect, the comparison does not work, with Britain. Now, I just want to conclude this section by suggesting some of a few complications. I'm going to take one instance here. So if you look at Tinde, I'm just going to mention the page number to you as well, in case you want to look up the reference. Page 166. This is what Tinde says in his survey history of South Asians in Britain. Though children, and I quote, though children from India and Sri Lanka have excelled in school, right? Muslim children from both Pakistan and Bangladesh have tended to lag behind in educational achievement at all levels, end quote. Now, if you just read that quotation and you don't think about it carefully, right, you'll immediately jump to the conclusion that what Tinde is saying is that, well, Muslim children lag behind. Okay? But notice that he says, though children from India and Sri Lanka have excelled. He doesn't say, though Hindus. No, he's saying that even Indian Muslim children do much better than Pakistani and Bangladeshi Muslim children. So it's not simply a matter of religion. It's not simply a matter of religion. So then obviously the question really arises, why are Indian Muslim children doing better than Pakistani and Bangladeshi Muslim children? Okay? Does it have to do with the fact that the heritage of democracy which Indians inherit, so to speak, right, that this has some lasting effects, right? I mean, could it have to do with that, right? Because if you said, well, it has to do with family structure, well, then, is the family structure of Indian Muslims remarkably different from the family structure of Pakistani and Bangladeshi Muslims? What is certainly true is that if you look at the political history of South Asia, and this is why you cannot disassociate the history of the diaspora entirely from the history of South Asia itself. That one significant difference, of course, in the political history of South Asia has been that for all of its failures as a democracy, India is still a democracy in some respects, right? In some substantial fundamental respects, it has been a democracy. And what that meant in turn was that there were certain structures of authority that got eroded. So the influence of the landholding class greatly diminished, for example, okay, of so-called feudal families. If you go to Pakistan, I mean, there have been lots of studies that have been done of Pakistan. I mean, the bulk of Pakistani wealth is in the hands of a handful of feudal families. And the connections they have with the military, for example. The role of the military in Pakistan is much greater than it is. In India, the civilian control, okay, over the military is complete. It's just like what you would find in the United States, or in Britain, or Australia, or Germany, or wherever else. In Pakistan, that's not the case at all. Right? You have got a much greater involvement of the military at all levels of Pakistani society. The question then becomes, does all of that have a bearing on what happens to educational attainments of the children of these diasporic families? Right? It's not a question that we'd have to get down to the nitty-gritty of detail here and start looking at, well, are there various patterns within this broader pattern? Is it the case that immigrant families from certain parts of Pakistan and Bangladesh do worse than other immigrant families, so forth and so on? But we're not looking at it at that level of detail. So on that same question, I just wanted to read out very briefly an article that appeared, which you can find online, I think, if it's still on there. It's called Patel versus Rasool. Okay, the Great UK Divide. This is from 2002. London. The Great Subcontinental Divide is alive and well, 7,000 miles away from India and Pakistan. Okay, as Britain digests the news that people like 12-year-old ethnic Indian Abhay Patel, well, the minute you read that name, you know what he is, right? I mean, he comes from a Gujarati family, right? With a name like Patel, you have to come from a Gujarati family, all right? And his Pakistani classmate Ahmed Rasool will grow up to be painfully different. Right? According to a new government study, boys like Patel are more likely to be white-collar workers. So they're going to enter into the legal profession, doctors, educators, right? For Rasool, the future may be bleak, and in the dole queue, end up getting benefits, right? The Patel-Rasool question is likely to become Britain's biggest policy headache in the next decade. All right, so this is written a decade ago, and we can now assess whether, in fact, this prediction was the case or not. All right, and you know that obviously there's been a long-standing concern in Britain, particularly after 9/11, with what happens to Pakistanis, even the second generation or the third generation. So for those of you who are looking at films like My Son the Fanatic and so on, that's where you'll begin to get some insights into these questions, whether these people became highly radicalized, particularly after 9/11 and so on. Okay. The study further says that Britain's Pakistani Muslims are 3 times more likely to be jobless than Hindus. I mean, that's a huge difference you're talking about. And they're all coming from South Asia. Indian Muslims do better than those from Pakistan or Bangladesh. But Indian Muslims are still twice as likely to be unemployed as Indian Hindus. Bangladeshi men are more likely to find jobs as cooks. So many of these Indian restaurants, by the way, that they speak about in Britain, they're actually run by Bangladeshis, okay, the bulk of them. Although the food is all this standard generic North Indian tandoori cuisine, and again, we'll have occasion to speak about that a little bit more later on. 1 in 20 Indian men is a doctor. That's an astonishing figure. 1 in 20 Indian men is a doctor, right? I mean, I guess you probably don't have to go to a hospital because you can just go to your neighbor and the likelihood is that he's a doctor, if you're an Indian, right? A ratio 10 times higher than for white men. And so, and they don't tell you how much higher the ratio is than for Bangladeshi men, Bangladeshi Muslim men or Pakistani Muslim men, so forth and so on. So you can see that obviously there's this immense stratification, and of course, the reason why this report is interesting is because what it's trying to point out is that we're no longer speaking of one Britain, we're speaking about multiple Britons. Right? That if you belong to a Pakistani Muslim family, well, you inherit and inhabit one kind of Britain. If you are a professional Indian and you're a Hindu especially, you inhabit a different kind of Britain. Right? And that, of course, has various kinds of other consequences. What is the ease with which you integrate into other kinds of circles? What are the social networks that you have? Right? So forth and so on. Right? So this is a kind of a broad picture. It'll be very useful for you. I mean, however interesting it may be intrinsically or not to some of you, but it will be the backdrop against which you'll have a better understanding of the Indian community in the United States. All right? So any questions about this particular segment, because that brings us to an end with respect to this particular segment having to do with Indians in Britain. Any questions about that anybody has? All right, let me now move let me start the next segment here, which is looking at the Indian community in the United States. But before we get to that, I think we should first pause to think in general about, the nature of American society in, let's say, the late 1890s. That's one set of questions. Why 1890s and the period after that? Because the first influx is really going to be around that time. If you read my book, which is now assigned to you because it's, as I said, a short history of this community, you'll find out that I point out that there is some evidence which we were not aware of before, but now it's certainly become clear that there is evidence of this kind, that there were Indians here even in, let's say, 1780s, the second half of the 18th century. Okay, because remember that before the United States becomes the United States, when you have these colonies on the eastern seaboard, you've got British plantation owners as well, right? A British aristocratic class as well, not obviously all of them, but there is a portion of that. Some of these people have connections with India. You would be interested to know, by the way, Yale University. I don't know if anybody here knows that Yale University is set up by a man called Elihu Yale. And who was Elihu Yale? He was a Britisher who lived in India and made a fortune there. He was the governor of Madras for a very substantial period of time. And then it is with the wealth that he makes in India that he comes to the United States and sets up a university which is named after him. Just as Harvard is named after John Harvard. Okay? Well, I shouldn't call them universities. They were not universities. They were colleges at that time. They only become universities, in the second half of the 19th century. In the 1880s, 1890s is when they become universities and become empowered to give graduate degrees. These are all colleges, and these are colleges that are set up largely for the training of young men to enter into the theological profession. That's what their purpose is. Okay? So Elihu Yale furnishes a good example of these kinds of tenuous links, and there must be many more. We know that there was trade. Something I mention quite often, and people are absolutely flabbergasted. Nobody has ever been able to give me a correct answer to this question. Not even people who've been reading widely for 60 years. What was the largest item of export from the United States to India? Okay, in, for example, the 1860s. Right? Sorry? Cotton. No. If it were that easy, everybody would have been able to. No. It's the most unlikely thing. And you could spend a lifetime trying to figure it out unless you've actually read about it. I'll tell you, because we don't have all the time at our disposal, ice. Ice. There's a book called The Frozen Water Trade. And you might think, how could that be possible? You would carve out huge chunks of ice. Okay? And large part of New England gets frozen for several months of the year. The lakes get frozen. Anybody ever read in school a book called Walden by Henry David Thoreau, one of the great master works of American literature? Okay? Now, if you read Walden and Henry David Thoreau, these are important things, because one thing we have to understand is that when we do the history of the diaspora, we also have to think about what are the tenuous links? What are these implicit links? What are the kinds of cultural histories that exist? So why is Henry David Thoreau important? Now, he is important for a number of reasons. Not only because he's going to write an essay, which some of you perhaps may have read in high school. All right? It's called On the Duty of Civil Disobedience. Okay? On the Duty of Civil Disobedience. And this essay is going to become highly influential for people like Mohandas Gandhi. Right? This is, I'm telling you, in a very cliched way, but it's important to know the cliche. We're not here to do a course on exactly trying to understand the relationship between Gandhi and Thoreau, but this is the general narrative, and fundamentally it's a sound narrative. So Thoreau writes this essay, it becomes highly influential for Gandhi, and of course Gandhi becomes highly influential for the African-American civil rights movement, for people like Martin Luther King, Bayard Rustin, and a number of people. Okay, so it's kind of a nice circle. It comes back, right? But it doesn't end there, because Thoreau was deeply steeped in Indian texts. deeply read in Indian texts. By this point in time, when I say Indian texts, I'm talking about texts from remote antiquity, the so-called scriptures, the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, the Vedas. These were all now available in translation. And Thoreau was part of a circle, right? It's called the American Transcendentalists, right? So again, I don't know if you did any of this in school. I spent 1 year in American high school, and luckily I did all of that there. You know, we read Emerson and we read Thoreau, at least segments of their writings. All right? And this circle, it's called the American Transcendentalists, a major movement in American literature and philosophy. Most of the people who belonged to this circle were profoundly interested in the philosophy of India and the literature of India. Right? So to go back to Walden, so you know Thoreau decided that he was going to live by this pond outside Concord, Massachusetts. And Concord itself is not far from Boston. It's basically a suburb, you could say. Right? He decided he would live there. And this Walden is a record of the 2 years that he spent over there. Right? So it is from ponds such as Walden, although it didn't come from Walden, that, you know, if you ever go there, I mean, the whole area, it's bodies of water. Now these get frozen, and they would carve out huge chunks of ice from there, and they would transport them in sacks, okay, to India, where you had a British class. You didn't have refrigeration at this point, of course. You didn't have it here, you didn't have it there. Right? In India, the problem is that to get such large chunks of ice, it has to be a very large chunk. Why? Because by the time it gets there, a good part of it has melted. So the larger that it is, right, the likelihood that some of it will remain by the time it gets there. And by the time it gets there, it's going to then be broken up, and it's going to be given to these Britishers who are going to have their gin and tonic at their club. Right? Sounds like a nice romantic story, but that's exactly how it happened, so to speak. Okay? This is a large item of export, okay, going from here to India. So there are these interesting, I mean, we could spend days looking at all of these different kinds of tenuous links. Right? But it's important, as I said, for you to keep in mind, because otherwise we're going to end up with a mechanistic kind of history. And that mechanistic history would be, oh, when did the Indians first come here? What were their numbers? How did their numbers grow? Right? Now, of course, all of that is important and interesting. And we're going to be doing a good chunk of it. But we cannot be confined only to that. Right? Because the question here is, what is the India of the imagination? For the dominant society, and of course for Indians themselves. That's the backdrop that we're really speaking about, right? So there's that backdrop. Then the other backdrop is, what are the earlier histories of Indian immigration into the United States? Those we can dispense with very quickly in just a few minutes when I start with this lecture on Thursday, right? And then moving into the 1890s, I just want you to keep these questions in mind. What was the nature of American society at that time? You know, what would you be able to say about it very briefly? All right? What are the histories of naturalization? What are the histories of naturalization? Right? Because let's be very clear that the struggle for rights is a struggle that every community has had to undertake. Right? And of course, the fact that there were large number of people in the United States who couldn't vote, including women, until well into the 19th century and 20th century in some cases. African Americans, when did they get the rights of citizenship? Right? Because when we're going to look at these naturalization laws, that history is important as well. One reason it's important is that we have to think about how different immigrant communities may or may not have forged political solidarity with each other. All right, so I'll stop there. Please take a look at my book, and we'll go back to this lecture on Thursday.